All right, so today we're going to be talking more about circuits. We're going to jump back to chapter 24 to do that one section on capacitors, and then we're going to continue on with chapter 26. So the first thing we need to talk about is AC versus DC current. So in this class, we're going to be dealing with DC current. I doubt we're going to get up to the AC current section, maybe in our last lecture, but probably not. So we're going to be dealing with DC current, which stands for direct current. So that is just a circuit that we've seen so far where you have current going through it in one direction, the same direction around the whole circuit, and it's just one current that goes around. So then alternating current is the other type of current. And now alternating current actually switches direction many times per second. In the US, I think it's 60 times per second, the direction of the current changes. So it changes super, super fast every second. And the magnitude of that current then is constantly changing because it follows the pattern of a sine wave. So this might seem a little counterintuitive that the electricity in your house is actually constantly changing directions, but AC current is used in all houses, apartments, buildings, everything uses AC current because it's much better at being transmitted over long distances, and it's very easy to change the voltage of alternating current as compared to direct current. So alternating current was actually invented by Nikola Tesla. Now I'm sure that everyone's at least heard of Tesla, the car, but Tesla the car was named after Tesla the man. So he was a prolific inventor in the 1800s. The 1880s was when he did most of his work, and he was just a total genius. Came up with things that were way ahead of his time, things that other people thought were just totally crazy and not possible. So he invented AC current. He also, basically all of the things that underlie our electrical system were developed by him. Transformers, it was all developed by him in the late 1800s, or most of it, I should say. So he worked on a lot of really interesting things and had a lot of crazy ideas. He said he developed a death ray particle beam, a directed energy weapon basically. Now he never actually built it, at least not publicly, so we don't know, maybe he did or maybe he didn't, but that's the story. And he also claimed to be developing free energy. So this is his lab that he built on Long Island, and JP Morgan was an investor in this energy lab that he had. So he was trying to develop free energy. He thought that you could basically just the earth had electricity essentially to it, and you could basically just pull this energy out of thin air and get totally free, totally clean energy, no negative environmental effects at all. So he was working on this, and he was convinced that he knew how to do this. And you could transmit this energy everywhere in the world and basically electrify the entire world for free at absolutely no environmental cost at all. So when JP Morgan found out, the story goes that when JP Morgan found out that he was developing free energy, he was like, well, why would I invest in something that's free? So he pulled his investment, and this project never completed. So maybe it's possible, maybe it's not, who knows? So he was a very interesting character. There's a lot of interesting stories surrounding him. And he was sort of in this, what's called the current wars with, it was between Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. And now Thomas Edison was one of the developers or the main developer of direct current. So Thomas Edison had made the first central power plant on Pearl Street in Manhattan, and he was sending out this direct current electricity to a couple of buildings nearby. And he obviously wanted to expand this operation and build infrastructure for his DC current electricity grid. Now, alternating current was sort of the rival to DC current. So Edison obviously didn't want to lose out to alternating current. There was a company that was investing in alternating current technology that had bought a patent from Tesla. And Tesla was convinced that his way of alternating current was better, and Edison was convinced that his way was better. So Thomas Edison basically engaged in this crazy propaganda campaign against alternating current to convince the public that it was unsafe and dangerous and that DC current was better and that we should power our buildings with DC current. So you have to remember also this was the 1880s. People didn't have electricity in their homes like we do now. the only everyday experience the average person had with electricity was lightning. So, it'd probably be pretty easy to convince people that it's unsafe because you're like, why would I want to bring lightning into my house? So it was sort of like an easy target to sway people. So Edison did some really crazy things to convince the public that AC current was not as safe as DC current. And I linked an article here. So back in like the 1880s, New York State was changing how they executed prisoners on death row from hanging to electrocution. And Thomas Edison actually was able to use his influence to convince them to make the first electric chair using AC current instead of DC current, and basically use that as like a publicity stunt to convince the public that AC current was bad and DC current was not executing people. So this actually worked, and the first prisoner was executed by electric chair using AC current, and it was like a total disaster. Like, it didn't work. It took the guy like 20 minutes to die. It was just horrible and grim and gruesome. So if you want to read about that more, I have this article here. But these current wars got very, grim, basically. But in the end, Tesla's alternating current won out. We don't use direct current in our houses. Our electricity grid is based on alternating current because at the end of the day, it's just the better technology and better for large-scale electricity grids. All right, so that's that story. Now let's go on to the section from chapter 24, capacitors in a circuit. So we can connect capacitors in a circuit, obviously, and we can connect them. The first way we're going to look at is connecting them in series. So in series is exactly what it sounds like. We connect the two or more capacitors in a series. So you have a battery here that provides some potential, some voltage. And then you have a wire that connects your first capacitor and then is connected by a single wire to your second capacitor. And if you have more, you just keep connecting them and then eventually bring it back to your battery. So this is called in series because we just have a series of capacitors connected via a single wire. Now, what we can actually do is circuits like this can be thought of as a circuit with actually only one capacitor. So there's a way to mathematically combine these two capacitors into an equivalent capacitance with only one capacitor. So before we see how we do that, let's see how the voltage is distributed across each capacitor. So we have some battery here. It's providing, like I said, some voltage V. Now, the voltage difference from A to B is this potential V. So we know that the potential across each capacitor, so we have like V total. So the potential across the first capacitor and the potential across the second capacitor have to add up to this total potential difference, right? Because our potentials add when we're going around a path. So V1, the potential over this capacitor, plus V2, the potential over this capacitor, have to add up to this total potential difference here. So now we can use our equation that we learned for capacitors, where capacitance is Q over V. And I can substitute out the potential here for C and Q. So I can rewrite V as Q over C. And let's rewrite our V total in terms of Q and C. So I have Q1 on capacitor 1 and capacitance 1. Then I have Q2 on capacitance 2 and capacitance 2 there. Okay, so what that means, the Q1 and Q2, we're going to have some charge. When the current goes down this wire, we know that current is just moving charge. So charge will build up on the plates of the capacitor, and since the capacitor has equal and oppositely charged plates, you'll get one charge buildup here, plus Q and minus Q, and then you could get a different charge buildup here. Now, in the case of capacitors connected in series, the charge buildup on, or at least the magnitude of the charge buildup on this capacitor has to be the same as the charge buildup on this capacitor because charge is conserved. And there's nowhere for, the current isn't going anywhere between here and here, right? So the charge has nowhere to go, and we know that charge is conserved. So the charge has to be equal between these two capacitors. They have to have the same magnitude of charge distributed on each one. So Q1 and Q2 are actually equal. So Q1 and Q2 are actually the same charge. So I can factor out a Q and write this as C1 plus 1 over C1 plus 1 over C2. And that's my total potential difference there. Now, this sort of looks like an equation for a single capacitor, right? It looks almost like this, except this term here is 1 over some new capacitance. It's the equivalent capacitance. So we can think of this distribution of capacitors, this setup of capacitors, as actually a single capacitor where the capacitance of that new equivalent capacitor is the reciprocal of 1 over C1 plus 1 over C2. So I just wrote that here. So our equivalent capacitance, 1 over our equivalent capacitance, is 1 over the sum of all of your capacitors connected in series. So that means that we can rewrite this circuit basically. So if we have a battery here, we can rewrite that circuit as a circuit with the same potential, but a single capacitor of capacitance C equivalent. So we'll do an example with this in a second, but this is the way that capacitors in series will add. Now I can also have capacitors connected in parallel. So in parallel just means that your capacitors are connected by essentially parallel wires here. So how does this circuit behave? Let's see how the charge is distributed first. To figure out how the charge is distributed on these two capacitors, we need to think in terms of the current because the current carries the charge. So if I have a current going down this wire, so this current, wherever it's coming from the battery, comes down this wire, and then at this point here where the wire splits into two separate paths, the current is going to split as well. I can't have the same current going down each wire because that would mean that I have the same amount of charge going down each wire. And if charge is conserved, how can I create an extra amount of charge to have equal amounts going through each wire? I can't. So the charge is going to split, which means the current is going to be split and different between each of these two paths. So this will be like I1 and I2, and the sum, so the total current will be equal to the sum of those two currents. So the current coming in here will be equal to the sum of these two currents going out. Now, what does that mean for the charge? Well, we can kind of guess that means that the charge is going to be different on the two capacitors, because if they have two different currents feeding into them, essentially, that means they have a different amount of charge coming at them. So these two capacitors are going to have two different charges. But again, the total charge will just be the sum. So Q total will just be the sum of the charge on the first capacitor plus the charge on the second. Now I'm just talking about the magnitude of the charge, since each capacitor has plus Q and minus Q. The total charge on each capacitor is 0, so I'm just talking about the magnitude of the charge on each plate. So now let's look at the potential difference. So how will the potential difference sort of distribute out between these two capacitors? Well, the potential difference between A and B shouldn't matter what path we take, right? The potential is path independent, so it only matters on our endpoints. So it doesn't matter if I take the path through capacitor 1 or the path through capacitor 2. My potential difference between A and B is going to be the same no matter what I do. So the potential between these are the same. So the potential difference between A and B is the same as the potential going across capacitor 1 is the same as the potential going across capacitor 2. So now I can, again, rewrite, I have C equals Q over V. So let's look at this equation for Q and use the fact that Q is equal to C times V to figure out how the capacitances behave in this scenario. So Q total, or we'll call it Q equivalent, is equal to C1 V1 plus C2 V2. All right, now we said that the voltages are the same, so V1 and V2 are the same. So I can factor that out. So I have V C1 plus C2 is equal to Q equivalent. So now again, this sort of looks like the equation for a capacitor of just one charge, one voltage, and one capacitance equal to C1 plus C2. So capacitors in parallel just add up. You just sum them up, and that will be your equivalent capacitance. So I can rewrite this, this circuit, these three capacitors, I can just rewrite them as a single capacitor of capacitance C1 plus C2 plus C3. And, my physics will look the same essentially. So let's do an example that uses up both parallel and series. So we want to find the equivalent capacitance of this setup. So that means what if I drew this as a circuit with a single capacitor? What capacitance would that single capacitor have? So I have two capacitors. These two are in parallel, and then these two are then in series with this third one. So let's look at the two in parallel first, since we know how to find the equivalent capacitance of those. So in parallel, we said that the capacitances just add. So if I want to turn this circuit, I can rewrite it as, I can rewrite this circuit first as an equivalent circuit with two capacitors, where I have C12 and C3. So C12 will be the equivalent capacitance of these two in parallel, and then C3 is just here, and then these are in series. So let's find the equivalent capacitance of C1 and C2. So they're in parallel. So C1 and C2 are in parallel, which means that C1, 2, so the equivalent capacitance of C1 and C2, is just equal to C1 plus C2. So that's 12 microfarads plus 5.3 microfarads. So that will just be equal to 17.3 microfarads. Okay, so now we have the equivalent capacitance of these two in parallel. And now I want to look at this circuit now as two capacitors in series, and then I can rewrite it as a single circuit with one capacitor. So I have to find the equivalent capacitance now of these two capacitors. So that now, so C equivalent is now in series. So I can write that. So in series, the equivalent capacitance is 1 over the equivalent capacitance plus 1 over the first capacitor plus the second. So that's equal to 1 over 17.3 plus 1 over 4.5. And I'm factoring out my microfarads for now. I'll leave that at the end. So this comes out to, this number comes out to, now this number comes out to 0.28, but that's 1 over the equivalent capacitance, right? We have 1 over, so we have 1 over equivalent capacitance is equal to 0.28. So to find the equivalent capacitance, we have to take the reciprocal of that. So 1 over 0.28 is equal to 3.57 microfarads. So this is the equivalent capacitance of this entire thing here. Can be rewritten as a single capacitor of capacitance 3.57 microfarads. And now be very careful when you're doing problems like this. Make sure that you take the reciprocal to find your equivalent capacitance. It's very easy to just think that the 0.28 is your final answer and forget to do that 1 over to find the equivalent capacitance. So be very careful of that. Okay, now we're going to take the same capacitor setup, but now we want to figure out if the potential difference applied, so if this potential difference here is 12.5 volts, what is the charge on capacitor C1? So we're going to have to work backwards, and this is going to take a couple steps to do because we can't figure that out right away from the information we have. So we have to do a couple steps and sort of work backwards to figure out what charge is on this capacitor. So the first thing you want to do is start back here, because we don't know, like I said, we don't even know what potential difference is going across these capacitors. We don't know what charge is on them. So the only thing we can figure out so far is the charge on this equivalent capacitor, because we know the potential difference across the equivalent capacitor. We know that it's 12.5. we know the capacitance of the equivalent capacitor. It's 3.57. So that means we can find the charge on this equivalent capacitor. So I'll call that Q equivalent will be equal to C equivalent times V. And V is just, like I said, the 12.5. So C equivalent we said was 3.57 times 10 to the negative 6. And then V was just 12.5. So this, when we multiply this out, that comes out to 44.6 times 10 to the negative 6 coulombs. So we can rewrite that. Let's just rewrite that as microcoulombs. So in this scenario where we just have the equivalent capacitor, this equivalent capacitor would have 44.6 microcoulombs on it. So now what we can do is take one step back further. So we can say, okay, well now we can sort of step back to this scenario where we had the two capacitors in series, and then try to figure out what is the charge on each of those then. Well, we know the charge on each of these because they're in series, and we said in series the capacitors have the same charge. So that means each capacitor in series here has 44.6 microcoulombs of charge on it. So we know now that Q12 and Q3 are both equal to 44.6 microcoulombs. So they both have that much charge on them. But we don't know the voltage across each capacitor, right? We just know the total voltage from over here to over here is 12.5. But we don't know across this capacitor, and we don't know across this capacitor. We just know that it adds up to 12.5. So we'll call that V is equal to V12 plus V3, and this will be equal to 12.5. So how do we figure out how much voltage drop is across each capacitor? Well, we have their capacitance and we have their charge, so we can find their voltage. So we can use V is equal to Q over C. And let's find the voltage drop over this top equivalent capacitor here, since we're looking, at the end of the day, we're looking for the charge on C1. So let's look at just this, because we don't really care about the voltage drop over here yet. So here we have the charge on this capacitor, we said was 44.6 microcoulombs. The capacitance of C12 was that equivalent capacitance we calculated here, 17.3 microfarads. So this comes out to 2.58 volts. So this is the voltage across this top capacitor. So across from point A to point B, that's a 2.58 voltage drop. And now if we wanted to find the voltage across the third capacitor, we don't need that for this problem, but if we did, now you have the voltage drop across this top capacitor here, and then you have the total, so you'll be able to just subtract and figure out what this V3 is. Okay, so now that we have the voltage across this, we said that in parallel, we can go back a step now and look at these as two separate capacitors in parallel. And we said that in parallel, the voltage across each capacitor is the same, because if we're looking at the voltage drop from point A to point B, no matter what path it takes, it's going to have the same voltage drop. So both C1 and C2 have a voltage drop of 2.58 volts. So let me write that here. Okay, so now we can Q equals C over V. So now we can figure out the charge finally on C1, because we're looking for the charge, we have the capacitance of C1, and we also know the voltage drop now. So we can figure this all out. C1 was 12 microfarads. The voltage drop we said was 2.58 volts. And this comes out to now 31 microcoulombs. So this is how much charge is on capacitor 1. Now, I know that seems very confusing, These types of problems, they all sort of follow the same pattern. Like you just work backwards to find whatever it is you need, whether it's the capacitance of one of these individual ones or the voltage or the charge. So they all sort of follow the same pattern. You just have to work backwards from that initial equivalent capacitance and then just work backwards until you get to that finally individual capacitor. So just do a lot of problems like this and it will get easier. I know the first couple are very confusing, but like I said, they all sort of follow the same pattern. So once you just do, maybe 5 or 6, you'll realize they're all sort of the same. But, like anything else, you just have to practice them a lot and then they won't seem that bad once you just get, a couple under your belt. All right, now let's move on to resistors in series. So just like I can connect multiple capacitors in a circuit, I can do the same thing with resistors. So if I connect 3 or 4 or 5 resistors in series, so these are connected in series, how will these act if I want to write them? If I want to write this as one single resistor of resistance R equivalent, how do I do that? How do these behave? So let's look, first we're going to need our Ohm's law, V equals IR. Now the current through each resistor here is going to stay the same, right? Because I've only got one current, one wire, so it has to be the same current. So the current through each one will be the same. So let's say I equivalent will be I1, same as I2, same as I3. And how will the voltage change? How will the voltage decrease as I go across each resistor? So for that, I know the total voltage drop from A to B will just be the sum of the voltage drops across each individual resistor. So V equivalent will just be, or the total voltage drop will just be V1 plus V2 plus V3. So now I can take Ohm's law here and just plug in IR for each of these terms. So the total potential drop from A to B will just be I1 times R1 plus I2 R2 plus I3 R3. But I know that the currents are all the same, so these I's are actually all the same. And then I can factor out the current. So I have I R1 plus R2 plus R3. And now this is my total potential drop. And now the same thing. This looks like Ohm's law for a single resistor of resistance R equivalent. We have some current going through them and we have some voltage drop across it. So my R equivalent for resistors in series just adds. So I can just find the equivalent resistance by just adding them up. But now what about resistors in parallel? So I can set up my resistors in parallel as well. So now I know that the voltage drop across each resistor is going to be the same. So V is going to be equal to V1, which is equal to V2, equal to V3, because again, if I'm just looking at the voltage, the potential difference from A to B, no matter what path I take, it has to be the same. But now my current will change, right? Because as my current, if I have current I going in here, when it breaks up into these 3 paths, I can't have the same current going through each one because that would violate the conservation of charge. So I'm going to have I1, I2, I3, and the sum total of those will be equal to this current I. So my total I will be I1 plus I2 plus I3. So now I can use Ohm's law. So I can use V equals IR, and I can write each of these currents in terms of V and R. So I'm going to rewrite each of these currents as V1 over R1 plus V2 over R2 plus V3 over R3. And now we said that the voltage is the same for each resistor because it doesn't matter what path we take, so these are all the same. So now I can factor out a V, and I'm left with 1 over R1 plus 1 over R2 plus 1 over R3. And now this, since my equation, my Ohm's law in this form would be I equals V over R, this now looks like a current and a voltage drop for a single resistance with this equivalent resistance. So for resistors in parallel, your equivalent resistance, again, just adds like the reciprocal. So 1 over the equivalent resistance is equal to 1 over R1 plus 1 over R2, and so on. Now, a couple things to be careful. These 1 over equivalent, both for the capacitance and the resistance, causes a lot of problems. So they're mostly just careless mistakes. So the first careless mistake that I notice the most on exams with this stuff is that students will write 1 over R1 plus 1 over R2 is equal to 1 over R1 plus R2. Now, obviously, that's not the way you add fractions, but on an exam when you're, stressed out and, nervous, that's a very easy mistake to make. So be super, super aware when you're taking the exam. Do not do that. The other thing is, like I mentioned before with the capacitance, they'll write this and then they'll just say, okay, this is equal to R equivalent. So you'll plug this into your calculator, you'll get some answer, and then you'll forget to take the reciprocal of it to find that R equivalent or equivalent capacitance. And this is the other most common mistake I make, and especially in these problems like the one we saw previously where there's a lot of steps. If you mess up on the first step by something like this, that's gonna, just sort of cascade to every other step, and then the whole thing will be wrong. So be really aware of these sort of mistakes on the exam. This is also why I warn against sort of just doing either everything in your calculator or everything in your head, because let's say if you made this mistake on the exam, but you didn't write down like this step, you didn't do like 1 over R1 and plug in the numbers and show me that at least you know what numbers to plug in, and then you just accidentally forget to take the 1 over R in your calculator, and I have no idea where this new number came from, I can't give you any points for that. But if you write down all of your numbers that you're about to plug into your calculator and make it really easy for me to see, oh, he had this written down correctly, and then, the numerical answer is wrong. So obviously it was just a mistake in the calculator, then you can get partial credit. So be really careful of this, and again, show as much work as you can on the exam so we can give you maximum partial credit. All right, now let's do an example with the resistors in parallel and series. So, okay, let's find the equivalent combination of resistors and the current, so we'll save that for last. So find the equivalent resistance of these 3 resistors. So we have 2 in parallel, and then it will be in series. So let's call this, we'll say this is R1, R2, and R3. So the equivalent resistance, we'll start with these 2 in parallel. So we'll find the equivalent resistance of R2 and R3. So these are in parallel. And resistors in parallel add like the reciprocal. So we have 1 over R23 is equal to 1 over R2 plus 1 over R3. So that's 1 over 6 ohms plus 1 over 3 ohms. That's equal to 1/2. So 1 over R23 is equal to 1/2, which means the equivalent resistance of these 2 resistors is equal to 2 ohms. All right, so this is an intermediate step. So we have 2 ohms here. So that means we can rewrite this circuit as a combination of 2 resistors in series now. All right, so now we have the 2 in series, and resistors in series just add. So now we have to find the total equivalent resistance. This is in series. So we just have R equivalent is equal to R1 plus R23. So that's equal to 4 ohms plus 2 ohms. So we get 6 ohms is our equivalent resistance of this entire setup. And you always want to, when you're doing these problems that have like multiple combinations in series and parallel, you always want to do the ones in parallel first. Because if you tried to do the addition, tried to do the ones in series first, it's not clear which resistance you would use when you add up R1. Do you add R2 or R3? So it's not, you can't do the series first. You have to start with the parallel, find the equivalent resistance of these, and then go on to the series one. The same thing goes for capacitors. Always do the parallel first and then do the series. Okay, so now we need to find the current in each resistor. So let me add a new page. So we have this. Okay, so the current in each resistor. So we're going to be using Ohm's law for this. And now we see here that we have a battery that's supplying an 18-volt EMF. Now it says that little r is 0, so that means that it's a perfect battery. It has no internal resistance. So the EMF of the battery is just 18 volts, and we don't have to worry about it losing energy or subtracting that little bit of energy that dissipates from the internal resistance. So it's just 18 volts here. So the current that goes through R1 is going to be whatever current is just in the circuit right here, because it just comes out of the battery here, and then it passes through. There's just a single wire. It doesn't split anywhere. So whatever current is in this part of the circuit here is the current that goes through R1. But we don't know that current yet. We have to use Ohm's law. So we know V for the entire circuit is 18 volts, and we know the equivalent resistance for the whole circuit is 6 ohms. So we can use that to find the current, basically, that goes through, the total current that goes through this circuit. So V is 18, and then that's equal to the current times the equivalent resistance. So that we said was 6 ohms, yeah, 6 ohms. So we can see here that I is equal to 3 amps. So the current that goes through the first resistor is 3 amps, and that's the current that goes around the entire circuit. So now when we want to find the current that goes through R2 and R3, we know that we have 3 amps coming in here, and then 3 amps is going to split. Some of it is going to go in this top portion, some of it is going to go in this bottom portion. Now physically, we would expect more current to go through this path here because it has less resistance. It only has 3 ohms of resistance, and things want to go down the path of least resistance. So we expect more of a current to go through this leg here and less current to be able to get through here. So that's something just to keep in mind at the end to make sure that our physics is making sense. So we're going to need Ohm's law again. So we know that the current through so we know that the current will be 3 amps, and it will be a sum of I2 and I3. So however much current is going through each of these will add up to 3 amps. So now we need the voltage over this section. So from C to B, we need to figure out what the voltage drop across this section is so that we can use Ohm's law to figure out the current through each. So now we know the equivalent resistance of these two. So let's draw it like this. If we think of it as just 2 resistors in series, the equivalent resistance of these two here was 2 ohms. So we can think of it as a circuit like this, where this is 2 ohms. And we know that the current then has to be 3 amps through both here. So we have 3 amps going around here. So we can just use V equals IR, and then we can figure out the voltage drop from C to B. So the current going through that equivalent resistor is 3 amps. The resistance is 2 ohms. So this gives us 6 volts. So that means that this is V23. So that means that the voltage drop from C to B is 6 volts, and we know that it's the same over both resistor because resistors in parallel are going to have the same voltage drop across them. So we've got the voltage drop now across each resistor here. So now we can use Ohm's law and figure out the current through each, because then we have the voltage through each, we have the resistance of each, we can find out the current for each. So for R2, we'll just have V2 is equal to I2 R2. So the voltage through both resistors was 6 volts. The current, we don't know. And then the resistance of resistor 2 was 6 ohms. So we can see that the current through The 6 ohm resistor is obviously going to be 1 amp now. So 1 amp through our second resistor. And now we can do the same thing for V3 for the third resistor. So V3 was again 6 volts, the same through each. The current and then the resistance of R3 was 3 ohms. So now we can see that the current through the 3 ohm resistor is 2 amps. So I3 is equal to 2 amps. And just like we expected, the current, more current flows through the 3 ohm resistor than the 6 ohm resistor because there's less resistance that way. All right, so what would happen in a circuit if the resistors are not in parallel or series? So we can have circuits like this where this is not really series and it's not really parallel. So what we've done so far, we can't solve using the techniques that we know yet. So we're going to need something else. And what we can do is we can use the fact that we know that energy and charge are conserved and apply those principles to a circuit, since circuits are basically just charge and energy. So the way we solve these, we use what are called Kirchoff's laws. Now, I have to be honest, almost every physics student, this is like the most hated thing in intro physics. I definitely hated it the most when I was doing intro physics because it can be very confusing. So I'm not trying to scare you, just warn you. If you feel like this is very confusing, most people feel that way. So the best way to look at it, like I said, is just realize that these aren't like some crazy rules that like we just kind of pulled out of the air. They're based on conservation of energy and conservation of charge, which we know and we're comfortable with. Energy can't be created or destroyed. Charge can't be created or destroyed. So we're going to take these very accessible concepts and apply them to circuits. So we need a little bit of vocabulary first to apply before we start applying Kirchoff's laws or rules. So the first is a junction. So we've already seen a junction actually. A junction is just where 3 or more current carrying wires meet. So this is a junction, this is a junction. These corners here are not a junction because you only have 1 wire, it's just bent. So a junction is anything with 3 or more wires coming into a point. And then a loop, we just draw a loop around our circuit. So this is a loop here, we just draw a big loop around our circuit. This is another loop in here, we just draw it around this portion of our circuit. And then we've got loops in here, and that's it. So what we're gonna do is apply conservation of charge at junctions and apply conservation of energy essentially around loops, because we know that if charge is conserved, like we said, the amount of charge you have coming into a junction has to be the same amount of charge that's leaving. So the amount of current coming into a junction has to be the amount of current leaving that junction, which makes sense. And then we know that the electric force is conservative. So if we go around a closed loop, we'll get 0 potential energy there. So using those two things, we can write Kirchoff's rules. So all this says is that the sum of the currents will be 0 at any junction. And we'll see how to assign the sign conventions for currents in a second. So the sum of currents going into and leaving a junction is 0. And the potential difference around any closed loop is 0, which is just conservation of energy. So again, here you can just picture you have 2 currents coming in. Let's say you have a current coming in on this wire and a current coming in on this wire. The current leaving that junction obviously has to be the sum of the 2, because you're not just creating, random current here. So it has to just be the sum. So let's do our sign convention, and then we'll do a couple of examples to sort of get used to this a little bit. So the sign convention for applying, writing out these sums for Kirchoff's rules, if we pass over a battery, so we draw our loop, we assign our loop some direction. So as you can see here, these loops all have little arrows on them. So you just pick a direction for your loop, and we'll see in a minute that it doesn't matter what direction you pick. So you just pick a direction for your loops, and then you just move along that loop and write down basically how much energy you lose or gain as you go around that loop. So if we move from the negative to the positive terminal of a battery, that will give us a positive boost in energy. We'll have plus the EMF of that battery. Now, if we go the opposite way, if we go from the positive terminal to the negative terminal as we go around our loop, we get a minus the EMF of that battery. So if we're traveling in the same direction as our current, so if our loop is going in the same direction as our current, we put a minus IR because we're losing energy as we go over that resistor. We're dissipating energy over that resistor, so we have a minus IR. Now, if we're going opposite the current, so if we're going the direction opposite the current here, we get a plus IR. So let's do a somewhat simple example with only one loop. So here I want to find, for this circuit, find the potential difference between points A and B. So if I want to find out the potential difference between A and B, I have to first know the current traveling around this circuit because I can't use Ohm's law if I don't know the current. And to find the current, we're going to have to use Kirchoff's rules. So there's only one loop here, right? There's just one loop of current, and there's no junctions. So I only have to use this rule. I'm just going to sum up the potential, all of the potential increases and drops as I move around my circuit here. So let's just start at this battery here. So our current is going counterclockwise, and our loop is also going to go counterclockwise. So the first thing we do is we cross over this terminal of the battery from negative to positive. So that gives us a plus EMF of the battery. So we get plus 12 volts. Then we immediately hit this little 2 ohm internal resistance. So since we're going in the direction of current, as we pass over a resistor, that means that we're losing energy there. We're losing some energy, so we'll have a minus I times the 2 ohms. And then we travel further down here. Now we pass over another resistor that we're going to lose energy as we go over. So it'll be minus I times 3 ohms. Then we keep going. We hit the internal resistance of this battery next. So we'll have another minus I 4 ohms. And then we hit the terminal of this battery here. Now this battery, we're going from the positive to the negative terminal. So that will be minus the EMF of the battery. So we'll have minus 4 volts. Then we keep going. We get to this resistor. We're going in the same direction as the current. So that will be minus I times 7 ohms. And then we're back where we started. So that's all equal to 0. So let's move things around a little bit. I'm going to keep my voltages here. I'm going to keep those on the same side. So I'm going to have 12 volts minus 4 volts. And then I'm going to move all this stuff over to the other side. So I'm going to have I times 2. I'm going to leave out my ohms. So on the other side, plus I times 3 plus I times 4 plus I times 7. So I can factor out an I, and then I'm left with 2 plus 3, which is 5, plus 4 is 9, and then plus 7 is 16. So I'm left with 16 ohms there. And then on the other side, I had the 12 minus 4, so that is 8. So my equation is 8 is equal to I times 16. So I is equal to 1/2. So I is equal to 1/2 of an amp. Okay, so that's how much current I have flowing around this circuit. Now I can figure out my voltage drop between points A and B here. So to find out the potential difference between these 2 points, I can sort of just do like a half, just only look at that half of my loop. So let me add a page. Okay, so I'm only going to look at the portion of my loop from here to here. But I'm going to do the same rules will still apply. So first I go over the terminal of that battery, so that's plus 12 volts. Then I have minus the current times 2 ohms. Then I have minus the current times 3 ohms. And then I'm at point A. So this will be equal to my potential drop between these 2 points. So I, we said, was 1/2, so we can replace I with 0.5. So this comes out to 9.5. So we have a 9.5 voltage drop between A and B. Okay, and now we want to know the power output of the EMF of each battery. So that will be for the 12 volt. This is just going to be the EMF times the current going through that battery. So this will be for the 12 volt. The EMF of the 12 volt is just 12, obviously. And then the current going through it is 0.5 amps. So this is 6 watts. So 6 watts of power being generated by the EMF of this top battery here. Now for the 4 volt battery, we're going to use the same equation. But we have to be a little bit careful with our signs here. So for the 4 volt battery, notice that we're going from the positive terminal to the negative terminal. That's the direction of the current. Whereas for the top one, the current was going from the negative to the positive terminal. So our EMF actually gets a negative sign here because our current is going from the positive to the negative terminal. So if you notice here, when we go from positive to negative terminal, that's a negative EMF. So we're going to plug in here negative 4 volts times our 0.5 amp current will give us obviously negative 2 watts now. So what does negative 2 watts mean? Well, it means that the battery's charging. So while this battery, that's why it's labeled live battery, it's a working battery, is generating energy, it's pumping energy into this circuit and allowing the charges to move. This battery is dead and it's being charged by the other battery. So energy is like coming into this battery and it's gaining energy as opposed to like creating and then dispersing the energy through the circuit. So, okay, that is this problem. We just had to find the power output of each. Okay, so now let's do a true Kirchoff's rule problem where we have multiple loops and multiple junctions. So for this problem, we want to find little r, so that's here, the internal resistance of this battery, the EMF over here of this battery, and the current through this battery over here, this current I. Okay, so luckily this problem already drew our loops for us. So we have one outer loop here in the clockwise direction, and then we have 2 inner loops that are both also in the clockwise direction, and we have 2 junctions A and B. So let's look first at junction A, since that's going to be the easiest thing to solve. So for Kirchoff's junction rule, we know that the current going into a junction will be equal to the current going out. So at junction A, we have a current of 1 amp coming in and a current of 2 amps coming in. So we've got 2 amps and 1 amp here. So that means leaving this junction will be a current of 3 amps. So we can just write this as 2 amps plus 1 amp. 1 amp will give us 3 amps. And then if you wanted to write this as a sum that's equal to 0, you would just move the 3 to the other side, and then that way your 2 currents that are coming into the junction get a positive sign here, and then your current leaving the junction just gets a minus sign, so everything is equal to 0. Now let's go on to the loops. So now we know what this current I is, so we already solved that. It's 3 amps. So this current I over here is 3 amps, right? Because then 3 amps has to go through this whole section here. So now let's look at loop 1. And now you can start anywhere you want on a loop. I'm just going to start at this 12-volt battery. You could start anywhere you wanted. So let's go through this outer loop here. So we start at the 12-volt battery. Now our current is going downward. So our current is going in the same direction as we drew our loop. So this will be plus 12 volt EMF. So we'll have plus 12 volts. We get to this little internal resistance here. The current is going in the same direction as our loop. So we do minus the current, which is 3, times the little resistance. Then we keep going around this loop, nothing yet, and then we finally get to this resistor over here. So now we're going to do another minus the current through this resistor. Now the current over here now is 2 amps, right? Because we have 3 amps over here, and then 2 amps over here, because we're losing one of the amps to this, this little junction here. So we have 3 amps, and then it becomes 2 amps over here. So we do minus 2 amps times the resistance, which is 3 ohms. And then we keep going, and we have nothing else around this loop, and we're back at the 12 volt battery. So that is all equal to 0. So if we want to solve for this little r here, we have 12, I'm going to ignore my units, 12 minus 2 times 3 is 6, is equal to 3 times r. So I have 6 equals 3r. So obviously r is just equal to 2. So this little resistor is equal to 2 ohms. And now I need to find the EMF in this battery here. So I'm going to use loop 2 to solve that. You could also use loop 3, it doesn't matter. They'll give you the same answer. So loop 2, let's start at this EMF over here, this EMF little battery. All right, so this is loop 2. So I am now going opposite the direction of my current. So I'm going from the positive to the negative terminal. So that's going to give me a negative EMF. So I have minus the EMF. Then I immediately get to this resistor. But again, I'm going in the opposite direction as the current here. So that will give me a plus 1 amp times 1 ohm resistor. Then as I travel more around loop 2, now I'm going in the same direction as the current once I get to this segment here, and I meet that 3 ohm resistor again. So since I'm going in the same direction as the current now, and we have the 2 amp current, that will be minus 2 times 3. And then I have nothing else. I'm back at my battery. So this is all equal to 0. So let's move things around a little bit. I have the EMF is equal to 1 minus 6. So that will give me negative 5 volts. So my EMF here is negative 5 volts. So what does that tell us? It tells us that this battery is also charging. Okay, now let's do a ugly example. So for this one that I showed before, we want to find the current in each resistor, the equivalent resistance of the combination of resistors, and the potential difference between points A and B. Okay, so let's first look at the currents. So this problem, again, we have all of our loops drawn already for us. So they chose loop 1 like this, loop 2 like this, 3 here, and then you have a 4th loop here. So we're looking for all of the currents that are unknown. So we have I1 here, I2 here, and then we have I3 here. Now what we're going to see with this problem is that, let's say that this problem didn't give us any directions for the currents and it didn't give us any loops. It's totally up to you how you draw your loops and what way you assign your currents. And we'll see at the end that it doesn't really matter. The physics will stay the same. So in this problem, we have current 1 going this way and current 2 going that way. Now that's obviously a natural choice because you know you're going to have a current coming out of this battery, so then you're going to have 2 currents leaving this junction. And so now this bottom part of the triangle is where you have a little bit more freedom. It's not obvious when you're just looking at this problem which way the current here through this middle piece will go. So just choose some direction. And we'll see at the end how to know which direction it actually is moving in. So just choose a direction here. And then at junction A, we have current 1 going into junction A, current 3 leaving. So that means that along this line coming out of junction A, we have current 1 minus current 3. Then at junction B, we have current 2 coming in, current 3 coming in, which means we have current 2 plus current 3 leaving. Then at junction D, we have this current coming in, this current leaving. So I1 minus I3 plus I2 plus I3 will have our I3 cancels, and we're left with just I1 plus I2 leaving this junction, which is what they have written here. So that's where these current assignments came from. Now let's figure out what current 1, 2, and 3 are. All right, so now let's look at some of our loops. So let's look at the first loop here. So this is our loops. Our first loop. Let's do Kirchoff's loop rule. So our first loop, we have from negative to positive over our battery, so that's going to be plus 13 volts. I'm going to leave out my units just so that things are a little bit cleaner. So I have plus 13 volts. Then I get to this section over here, so I'm going in the same direction as the current I assigned. So that will be minus 1 ohm times the current I1. Then as I move down here, I have again 1 ohm, so it's going to be minus my 1 ohm times the current, which is I1 minus I3, according to the assignment they made here. And then I get back, as I go around, I get back to this battery, so I'm done. So that's all equal to 0. Okay, so I just rewrote my loop 1 just so that's a little bit clearer. So now let's go on to loop 2. And I'll move my loop 1. Okay. So now let's look at loop 2, which is this outer loop here. So for loop 2, I'm going to again start on my 13 volt battery. So I have plus 13 minus my first thing that I get to is this resistor over here. So I'm going to minus the 1 ohm resistor times I2. So minus I2 times that 1 ohm resistor. Then I have, I come across this resistor, still going in the same direction as the current, so it's going to be minus again, minus the 2 ohm resistor, I2 plus I3 is the current there. And then we have nothing else until we get back to our battery. So this is all equal to 0. So again, let me write this a little bit clearer. Minus I2 minus 2I2 plus minus 2 times I3. So that is equal to 13 minus 3I3 minus 2I3 is equal to, oops, that's I2, is equal to 0. Okay, so now we have this. And now we still have one more loop that we need because we have 3 unknowns. That means we need 3 equations. So we have, we don't know I1, we don't know I2, and we don't know I3, so we need a third equation, which is why we have a third loop there. Because if you have 3 unknowns, you need 3 equations. So our third loop, and now you could also do, you could do the loop down here too, instead of doing the loop up here, it doesn't matter. So let's do the top loop. So the direction chosen was this counterclockwise direction. So first, as we move along our loop, in the direction of the current, we first cross over this resistor. So we have minus I1 times that 1 ohm resistor. Then next, we cross over this 1 ohm resistor. So it's still minus since we're in the direction of the current. Minus I3 times that 1 ohm resistor. And then we cross over, we have this other 1 ohm resistor over here, but we're going in the opposite direction as the current now, right? I2 is in the opposite way. So we're going to do plus I2 times that 1 ohm resistor, and we get 0. Okay, so that's negative I1 minus I3 plus I2 is equal to 0. So we have this equation, and this equation. Now what we have to do is solve, use a system of equations, solve each one, and then you'll find I1, I2, and I3. So when I post the solutions, I'll show how I solved it. But since we're kind of running out of time, I'm just going to write the answer. And then if you have any questions about the algebra I did, obviously feel free to ask. So this comes out to I1 becomes 6 amps, I2 becomes 5 amps, and I3 is -1 amp. So this is important because when you get a negative, so when you, if you do a problem like this for homework, and at the end, when you solve for all your currents, you get a negative sign in front of one or more than one of your currents, that just means that you picked the wrong direction to draw your current. So when you said, okay, I'm just guessing that my I3 is going to be going to the right, that means physically it actually is going to the left. So that's all it's telling you with that negative sign there. Now, to find the equivalent resistance of this entire thing, we can just use one big Ohm's law. So what we're going to do is use Ohm's law. So we have V equals IR. So now we know what I1 plus I2 is. So we know the current that's going through this entire circuit here is I1 plus I2 right here. So I1 plus I2 is 11 amps, the 6 plus 5. So I1 plus I2 is 11 amps. So this is 11 amps. Now the voltage across the whole circuit we know is 13 volts because that's what our battery is supplying. So we know this is 13 volts. And then we can just find the resistance here. And that would just give us the equivalent resistance of this whole thing. So we don't have to worry about if they're in parallel or series or whatever. This will just give us the equivalent resistance. So then we just have a simple Ohm's law to plug in. We have 13 equals 11 times the equivalent resistance. And so the equivalent resistance is just 13 over 11, which gives us 1.2 ohms. And that is our equivalent resistance. Okay, so that's it for today. I know this was a lot. I know a lot of people have problems with Kirchoff's law. I certainly did. It took me a really long time to get comfortable with it. So, just do some practice problems, and for the exam, I wouldn't give you something that's this involved, where you have a system of 3 variables to solve for, maybe 2 at the most. But I wouldn't give you something this involved on an exam where you're under time pressure to solve something like this. But this is just good to make sure that you understand how to, sort of a limiting case of how to apply Kirchoff's law or rules. So, all right, so that's it for today. We will finish up chapter 26 tomorrow, and I will see you guys then.